Hello, and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will talk about all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. Having finished our journey through time, where we took a historical magnifying glass and glimpsed every step of King Afonso I of Portugal, from his rise to power, through his glorious conquests, his political endeavors, the birth of a nation, and ending in his death. Today, we bring you a metaphorical bridge between the founder of Portugal and the rise of his son Martin, who, months after his birth, would be called Sancho. I'd just like to remind you that for those of you who haven't had the chance to listen to the episodes about the life of King Afonso I, better known as King Afonso Henriques, where we talked about his life in great detail, you can do so via our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com, or via the usual podcasting platforms. You can find all the links to our socials on our website. Stop by and give us a like. It costs nothing and it really helps us out a lot. So, let's get down to business, shall we? Let's start this off with Sancho's first steps. He was born in Coimbra on the 11th of November, St. Martin's Day, hence his birth name Martin, in the year 1154. And in his early years he grew up in a quasi-Portuguese rural paradise. It is assumed that he may have had a good formal education, as he could probably read and even write. As the fifth son and second male child of the marriage between King Afonso I and Matilda of Savoy, there were initially no great expectations for the young prince's future, but everything changed when his older brother Henry died at the tender age of 8 in 1155. This tragic event throws onto Sancho's back the gigantic weight of the inheritance of a kingdom recently formed by his father, who was considered a great hero and a leader of his people. A kingdom that had almost tripled in size since its infancy as a county. It's useful, however, before we start dissecting the life and footsteps of the man who would come to be known as King Sancho I, to zoom out a little bit and take a look at what's happening around us in Europe. Because one of the problems when we study history in school is that we tend to look and focus exclusively on a single character or a single country, as if we were on a desert island in the middle of the sea. Portugal didn't evolve or grow in isolation from everything and everyone. There is a whole story being told in many other surrounding and distant regions and kingdoms, which adds a lot of important context and flavor to the era we are narrating. By the time Sancho was born, Europe was going through profound changes. Feudalism, which had flourished after the fall of the Carolingian Empire at the end of the 9th century, was beginning to weaken, as kings began to find ways of centralizing their power. King Afonso Henriques was one of the first and probably best examples, along with possibly Henry II, King of England, and something that historians today call the Angevin Empire. So let's begin our journey throughout Europe, from west to east, passing through the most important kingdoms and most remarkable episodes, not only of the period in which Sancho lived and reigned, but also some of the highlights during his father's life. We'll leave the Iberian Peninsula for last, as this will serve as a link to the continuation of our narrative. Europe was already a mostly Christianized continent, with the exception of the Muslim territories of the Iberian Peninsula and the pagan kingdom of Lithuania, that was still flourishing in the east and would be the cause of many headaches for the Polish kings and Russian princes until 1387. Let's start in England. At the time of Sancho's birth, a period called anarchy had ended, during which the Norman dynasty, which began in 1066 and was represented by King Stephen, faced a new force headed by Empress Maud, mother of the aforementioned King Henry II. If you've seen or read the books or series Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, it takes place precisely during this period. In December of 1154, while our Sancho was a month old, King Henry II of England ascended the throne. and in addition to his territories in England, he also had Normandy in the northwest of France, inherited from his mother, Anjou and Maine, also in the northwest of France, inherited from his father, and he would also add Aquitaine and several territories around it in the southwest of France to his patrimony due to his marriage. In other words, the English would soon control more of France than the King of France himself. All of this territory is called the Angevin Empire, named after Anjou, the county where Henry II's paternal family originated from. Henry II was king in England and liege of the Irish lords and temporarily over the King of Scotland. But in France, despite all the territory he ruled, he was still technically a vassal of the French king. It is very obvious what consequences this was going to have. The overly powerful Kingdom of England would not willingly accept the humiliation of having to pay vassalage to the Kingdom of France, and the latter could not cope with having such a powerful vassal always looking to threaten their royal power. And now add this to a pot of boiling water, a pinch of salt, some bitter herbs, a few plague outbreaks, and you have the ideal recipe for centuries of war. Speaking of France, Louis VII was one of the first Capetian kings to rediscover that there was more to France than Paris, and he made a huge effort to reassert royal authority to those counts and dukes who had become used to living as kings for far too long. Before him, it was literally inadvisable for French kings to leave the vicinity of Paris and wander around a kingdom that was, well, technically theirs, but which was mostly in the hands of nobles, be they dukes, counts, barons, etc. There is still a lot of discussion today about whether Portugal had true feudalism or not. It is a discussion we don't want to get into, but if France is used as the traditional model of what constitutes feudalism par excellence, then no, we didn't. Louis VII and his son Philip Augustus were instrumental in irrevocably changing this state of affairs. However, Louis VII made a big mistake when he asked for an annulment of his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, heiress to a huge duchy in the southwest of France, who soon after married the aforementioned Henry II, who added his territories to the English crown, as we mentioned before. This would bring massive complications to the already fragile relations between the English and the French for centuries to come, and would be the origin of the 100 Years' War. What's important to note now is that Sancho saw, throughout his life, the height of this so-called Angevin Empire and also its collapse. Another curious fact, the famous Robin Hood, if he really existed, probably not in our opinion, must also have lived during Sancho's reign. Moving towards the center of Europe, the war between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy continued and was about to heat up even more. First of all, we have to give you some contextual information. The Holy Roman Empire is a huge feudal bloc in Central Europe that encompasses the territories of today's Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Czechia, Austria, Switzerland, Slovenia, and parts of present-day Poland, France, and Italy. Its roots lie in the Carolingian Empire, which was founded on December the 25th of the year 800, with the coronation of Charlemagne in Rome. He was previously king of the Franks. But why is a gigantic empire of this caliber butting heads with the papacy? The reason behind the origins of this imperial coronation is too complicated for a podcast of this nature, but we can simplify it like this. The emperor was a kind of continuation of the Roman leaders of antiquity and their natural successor, albeit more than 300 years later. Due to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there was only one emperor left, the Eastern Roman Emperor, to whom, if only in theory, the barbarian kings of Western Europe paid homage. For example, King Clovis of the Franks received the title of consul from the Eastern Emperor when he defeated the Visigoths and expelled them from Gaul. In the year 800, after many decades of tense relations between the popes in Rome and the Eastern Roman emperors, also known as Byzantines, in Constantinople, the Pope decided to restore the old idea of two empires and crown an emperor for the West. At the time, it seemed like a stroke of genius. The Pope was freeing himself from the rule of Constantinople and creating a new sovereign, much closer to home, who would be easier to control. But things didn't work out that way. Charlemagne, at the height of his power, deserved the nickname he was later given, Father of Europe, since when looking at a map, there was nothing outside the Christian West that wasn't within his domain, with the exception of a few small confused kingdoms in the British Isles and a so-called Kingdom of Asturias further west. Later, during King Afonso Henrique's life and the future King Sancho I, some Holy Roman emperors would claim supremacy over kings and kingdoms, while also claiming the legacy of the Roman emperors of the West, something that the papacy had a true disdain for. But despite all these efforts, the Holy Roman emperors would never achieve much. The papacy, on the other hand, based their legitimacy on sacral power. But who, after all, was the descendant of Saint Peter, the rock that Jesus chose as the foundation for his church? In chapter 16 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That is to say, the Pope is, quote-unquote, the successor of Peter, the highest representative of Christ's church on earth, and therefore, his power was not based on any political or human institution. The emperors depended on the papal coronation for their legitimacy. The popes argued that they owed their power to no one but the divine. For fans who are familiar with the acclaimed video game Age of Empires 2, you probably remember the Barbarossa campaign, and you'll understand better what we're going to talk about next. Since 1155, on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire sat a character named Frederick Barbarossa. He was a man determined to give a new meaning to the imperial title, which had been undermined by the nobles of the territory and the Pope in the so-called the investiture controversy. In short, the emperor considered himself head of the church, just as the Roman Caesars had been after Constantine. And so he thought he had the right to interfere in church affairs, including appointing priests, bishops, and even popes. The popes had already started this investiture controversy coming down on the civil power by saying that no king, duke, or count has the power to appoint bishops, priests, abbots, let alone popes. Simply trying to keep the church independent of civil power, they ended up expanding their ambitions and declaring themselves superior to the emperor, and began the dispute to have their supreme authority recognized by all. Do you remember when our own King Afonso Henrique finally got the bull Manifestus Probatum, declaring Portugal a kingdom? This is, in essence, another way for Pope Alexander III to show Emperor Barbarossa who really had the power. I can even create a brand new kingdom from nothing, and then go out for a nice brunch and call it a Saturday. From this point of view, we can see why it probably took him so long to send this bull. Maybe he was a bit busy with all the problems Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and the anti-popes he elected were giving him. This issue was only resolved with the so-called Peace of Constance in July 1177, a couple of years before the bull that elevated Portugal to kingdom. This had serious consequences in Italy, as the northern cities, supposedly under the authority of the Holy Roman Empire, allied themselves with the Pope in order to achieve their own autonomy. This process had its ups and downs and led to centuries-long wars between the so-called Guelphs and Ghibellines. But in the end, the result was the establishment of practically independent republics and city-states that would be the cradle of the Renaissance. We'll come back to this notion later. Let's now look at Northern Europe. The Scandinavian kingdoms were already fully consolidated, as the Viking Age had already ended. According to most scholars, it ended in 1066 with the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England, where the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada was defeated and killed while trying to conquer it. Eventually, the Kingdom of England would fall to William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, that same year. This event was the beginning of all the conflicts and tensions between England and France throughout the Middle Ages. Now, the flourishing kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were Christianized and perfectly integrated into European power dynamics, establishing regular contacts with the British Isles, France, and of course their eternal neighbors, the Holy Roman Empire. As a result of their conquests and colonizations, the Nordics enjoyed an enormous radius of action. Greenland, Iceland, the rivers of the Russian steppe, which, in spite containing a majority Slavic population, would be the place where the Norse would later found Russia, which included the Principality of Kiev in present-day Ukraine, the Norman kingdoms of England. Norman literally means men of the north, since they were the ones who settled in the region of Normandy, today's France, and also the Norman kingdom of Sicily, which at this time essentially included the southern half of the Italian boot, the islands of Sicily and Malta. Their explorer and warrior demeanor also led to the formation of groups of Norman soldiers who fought in the Holy Land, as well as the famous Varangian Guard, an elite personal guard established in 988 by the Emperor Basil II of the Byzantine Empire, which served all subsequent emperors. One of the most notable names in this top-tier guard was none other than Harald Hardrada himself, who, on his travels from Norway to the banks of the Dnieper, was lured by the hefty reward that such a position would pay. Although they may seem like unimportant details, they have a very strong impact in the world of today. For example, from his own statements, one of Vladimir Putin's motivations for invading the Ukraine is that it was the cradle of the united Russian identity, being the capital of a principality that, at its height until the Mongol invasion, covered a large part of present-day Ukraine and formed the core of the territories we now call European Russia. Moscow had not yet been founded, and the major metropolis in the north was Novgorod, a merchant republic also founded by northerners that owed vassalage, albeit sometimes only nominal, to the princes of Kiev. To the east, two kingdoms that had remained pagan up until this point in time and had even given Christian territories of the west some major headaches were now firmly Christianized and integrated into a medieval Europe: Poland and Hungary. This had happened around the turn of the year 1000, and year 1000 is an expression that historians use to signify a transition in European civilization, which went from the so-called High Middle Ages, which used to be the Dark Ages, to the Full Middle Ages, a much more prosperous period of great development. You don't believe me? Just think of universities or Gothic cathedrals, both products of these Middle Ages, and which show how much Europe has evolved since the year 1000. To the east, the Komnenos reigned in Constantinople, a dynasty that had managed to restore some of the prestige and power of the ancient Eastern Roman Empire. In fact, the Byzantines had concluded the 11th century with practically all of Asia Minor lost after the debacle that followed the heavy defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 against the Seljuk Turks. In fact, it was because of this huge loss that the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I asked the Pope for help, which in turn led to the Crusades. Now, some 50-odd years later, much of the lost territory had been reconquered, and the Turks were no longer in a position to pose an effective threat. It would end up being the Catholic Christians to condemn the empire to collapse, which happened while Sancho was still alive, but we will get to that. Just commit this event to memory, the Fourth Crusade of 1204. While we're on the subject of crusades, let's take a look at the Christian territories in the Levant. The Levant is an area of the Middle East, more specifically the present-day territories of Cyprus, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, as well as southeast Turkey. As you may remember from our fourth episode when King Afonso Henriques conquered Lisbon, he had the help from crusaders who were going to take part in the Second Crusade. This had been launched to retaliate against the Muslims who had managed to destroy one of the 4 states created after the First Crusade, the county of Edessa, located in the south of present-day Turkey and to the north of Syria. After the failure of this crusade, whose only success, as we mentioned in the previous episodes, had been the conquest of Lisbon, the remaining Levantine Christian states remained stable, mainly because the Muslim world was still divided. But this was not to last, and once again during the lifetime of King Sancho I, the Christian territories in the Holy Land were practically destroyed. Saladin was the Muslim hero who reconquered Jerusalem, that thrice holy city. In response, the Pope proclaimed the Third Crusade, and 3 of the most powerful European kings decided to take part: Philip Augustus of France, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, and Richard the Lionheart of England, the son and successor of Henry II of England. The first remained in the Levant only for a short time, having quickly returned home to take advantage of the absence of the English king Richard the Lionheart, and began plotting to take territory from him. The second, Frederick Barbarossa, the most powerful of them all, after an exhausting march through Europe and Anatolia, drowned in the river Göksu in the south of present-day Turkey, and his men dispersed, with few taking part in the fighting in the Holy Land. This unfolding made Richard the Lionheart the great hero of the crusade. Richard, after spending years fighting his own father, became his successor when his father died in 1189. Among the first things he ordered was the preparation of an expedition to take part in the Third Crusade, which had since been announced by the Pope. Among the many measures he implemented, the so-called Saladin's Tithe stands out, in which he imposed a 10% tax on all property in his territories, something which, naturally, didn't make him very popular with the taxpayers. There was a joke at the time, which may very well be true, that the king would even have sold London if he had found a buyer for the city. At the end of many months of campaigning, several battles, trading punches, scuffles, and a few adventures, this alone would make a whole new episode, Richard gave up on the crusade, having signed an agreement with Saladin that guaranteed the coastal cities for the Christians, but left most of the territory and, most importantly of all, the city of Jerusalem in the hands of the Muslims. This era is portrayed in the also very famous video game Assassin's Creed 1, as well as Ridley Scott's film Kingdom of Heaven. This Third Crusade had an impact on Portugal and the reign of King Sancho I, as we shall see. If you can, pay a visit to Silves in the Algarve region, and you'll see for yourself. Moving further north, the 12th century saw the expansion of the influence of the Principality of Kiev over the territories that now make up the core of Russia. One thing that helps us to understand the religious map of Europe today is to understand that the origin of Catholics and Orthodox lies in the definitive division of the Roman Empire in the year 395. 2 empires with 2 emperors and 2 capitals would birth 2 distinct churches. While the Catholic influence expanded in the West, Christianizing peoples such as Western Slavs, Czechs and Poles, and also Hungarians, Anglo-Saxons and the Nordic peoples, in the East, the Orthodox expanded their influence to include the other Slavic peoples, Balkans, Ukrainians and Russians, Bulgarians and others. By the year 1000, the Nordic immigrants who had settled on the eastern plains had already mixed with the majority Slavic population and laid the foundations for several Russian territories headed by Kiev. This situation would continue until the advance of the Mongols from the year 1240 onwards. For all these reasons, the reign of King Sancho I saw major changes throughout Europe and the surrounding world. Some of them were to be catastrophic, while others planted the seeds of very important things to come in the future. We've now come to the end of this episode, where we've seen that history goes far beyond the Iberian Peninsula, and that what happens beyond the Pyrenees has a tremendous influence on the present and future of Iberian kingdoms. Don't miss the next episode, where we will travel back to the Iberian Peninsula to talk about what was happening at the time of the transition of power in the new Christian kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. That's right, Portugal. Until then, take care, kings and queens.